You're listening to the Nourished Child Podcast, episode number 84. Let's hit it.
Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
We all want emotionally healthy kids, right? It tears my heart when I see my kids unhappy. I want to, quote unquote, save them when they struggle. I want to make life easy for them. I don't think I'm alone in this desire. And while I'm a big believer in consequences and letting my kids figure it out, I would never intentionally make things harder for them. Because life is already H-A-R-D, hard. I was in yoga class today and a few women were talking about how much harder it is to grow up now than it was when we, women of the older generation, were collectively younger. Of course, this is relative and highly dependent on each of our circumstances. But personally, I was reflecting on this and I thought I had a pretty sheltered life growing up. There were lots of no's and rules, especially when it came to social situations outside of my family. And honestly, that was hard for me. I remember feeling left out, disconnected from my friends, sometimes angry at my parents. But at the same time, now when I think about it as an adult, I recognize that having these rules and these no's or these sort of hard lines where my parents were like, we're not doing this, that removed a lot of the decision making I would have had to make on my own, particularly in social situations. So the rules kept me out of trouble as well. They kept my world small and, whether this is good or bad, they kept me quite naive. When I think about today's world and my own children growing up in it versus what I grew up with 30 years ago or so, it's much more complicated now and rife with challenges that didn't exist back then. Think about social media and the role it plays in our kids' lives, academic competition for school placement, the job market. I have a graduate. The job market is tough, especially when you don't have any experience. Social norms and the pressures around them, drugs, alcohol, mental health challenges. There's so much out there that our kids today have to deal with, and it can simply feel downright impossible to raise an emotionally healthy child. How in the world do we do that? Well, today on the show, I have Maureen Healy, two-time author, educator, and psychologist. Maureen is the author of The Emotionally Healthy Child and the book called Growing Happy Kids, which won Nautilus and Reader's Favorite Book Awards in 2014. A popular Psychology Today blogger and sought-after public speaker, Maureen runs a global mentoring program for elementary-age children and works with parents and their children in her busy private practice. Her expertise in social and emotional learning has taken her all over the world, including working with Tibetan refugee children at the base of the Himalayas in northern India to classrooms in Northern California. So we are going to tap into Maureen's expertise for this interview today. You'll be able to find this interview and all the links in the show notes over at jillcastle.com/084. That is 084 for episode number 84. So just a few comments and reminders before we get started. I spent my last weekend in Syracuse, where my daughter just graduated from college. And so I have one that is grown and almost flown. She starts her job in mid-June in New York. So that's been really a fun process for me to observe. Stressful for her, but fun for my husband and I to watch her culminate her college experience and start looking forward to adulting. I am, it's May as I record this. I am in the height of rowing and regattas and intensive competition with my youngest child, and also in my speaking travel. So I'll be in the month of May speaking in 3 different venues. And if you happen to be in any of these venues, please say hello, reach out. I'd love to meet with you. I'll be in Scottsdale at the Today's Dietitian meeting, speaking there. I'll be in Somerset, New Jersey at the American Academy of Pediatrics meeting. And I'll be in Kansas City at the Nutrition Adventures conference. So again, if you're in any of those locations, you happen to be attending those meetings, please reach out and say hello. I'd love to meet you. If you have a college graduate or you know one, you've got to listen to my last episode, number 83, with Katie Morford, who came on the show to talk about her brand new cookbook called Prep, the Essential College Cookbook. She talks us through why it is so important for young adults to know how to cook, and she gives us a review of the 101 training she included in the book to get all college grads, and quite frankly, high school grads and even middle school kids could tackle some of these recipes to get started and build confidence in the kitchen. Again, that's episode number 83, our last episode that aired. And then on the next episode, number 85, I have guest Jevi Stone on the show. She's an elite lightweight rower who is training for the 2020 Olympics. She's also a medical resident. So we'll be talking about how she fuels her body for rowing and the balancing act of intensive training for the Olympics and what that looks like, as well as becoming an ER doc, because there's quite a bit of intensive training that goes into that as well. I hope you'll tune in for it. I don't think you should miss it. I loved talking with her. And I think if you have a child who's a young athlete, doesn't have to be a rower, it can be any sport. I think you'll love the inspiration she gives for all of us to just follow our dreams, no matter how challenging they seem to be. Hi, Maureen. Welcome to the Nourished Child podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's nice to have you here, and I understand that the weather in California has got to be a lot better than the weather here in Connecticut today as we record this show.
It's warmer, but it's rainy. But I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy for the rain since we've had a drought. So it's all good.
Yeah. So you work with children and you've written this amazing book called The Emotionally Healthy Child, which we're going to talk about today. But before we kind of dig into our interview, I'd love for you to just tell the audience about the work that you do, how you got into it, and how it relates to going on this journey of writing a book about the work that you do.
Sure. I mean, I guess from the most simple standpoint, as a child and like most kids, I wanted to feel good. And as I grew up, when I went to college, I studied psychology and have an MBA and did my doctoral work in child clinical psychology. And I always wanted to know, how do we feel well? I started my career working actually in business with CEOs. And ironically, I found out that, sometimes they act like children. So yeah. So I actually wound up going back to school to just work with children that's when I studied child development. So, I didn't start in working with, I always was doing sort of counseling and coaching work, but I wound up narrowing in on children and social emotional learning, in particular children's emotional health. And I've lived in India and the US and studied with teachers around the world. So, that's sort of my background is both Eastern and Western psychology. And I was delighted to have the Dalai Lama write the preface for this book for the second edition. So that's exciting. And, that's really probably what sets me apart is I have a different perspective on children's emotional health. I mean, it's grounded in science, but it's also sort of giving sort of wisdom tidbits to help children create that well-being sooner rather than later.
And I, in my practice of working with children, emotional health is, I think it's an area that is becoming increasingly something that gets discussed, that is a factor, even in the work that I do. And as you know, I work just with children in that area of food and nutrition. But I imagine that this is a much broader topic, and it really encompasses a child developmentally from birth to adolescence, and then in all sorts of aspects of their lives. So because you focus on emotional health, do you feel it's as important or more important than some of the other things like physical health, intelligence, social skills? Or is it, where do you land with that?
Yeah. My first book called Growing Happy Kids was about inner confidence. And in that book, I sort of set out the stage of sort of my mindset, which is always it begins with biology. Because if your biology or your physical isn't right, then you can't even think happier thoughts or feel happier feelings. So I always think that it starts with biology and then your mental mindset and then your emotions, right? So depending upon what you do with your mind, what you think and actions you take, you feel a certain way. I do know. I mean, for example, if you're learning hula hoop and you are learning hula hoop and you're not doing that well and you think, oh, I stink, that feels a certain way. Or if you think, oh my gosh, I'm getting better and better, that feels a certain way. So helping kids, with their bodies and then their minds and then their emotions and then social, of course, and then creative or spiritual is important. So I really take a holistic perspective, even though I specialize in children's emotional health. Like, they're all different pieces of the puzzle that are interconnected.
Yeah. And so, you go on in the book about how important it is for children to learn about their emotions. Do you feel that children today have a good handle on their emotions, or have we made progress in that area as parents, or have we dropped the ball in that area? Where are we today with children and their knowledge about their own emotions?
Well, the idea is that, children, it's normal to start from like a place of emotional reactivity, right? So when you're young and you want to be fed, you cry. It's just the way life works. So, it's really as they mature emotionally and develop emotionally, how do we give them the ideas of how emotions work and then how to express them constructively? So sometimes that happens in the house, sometimes that happens in the classroom, sometimes that doesn't happen. So it's not that there's any fault or blame on anyone, but we have the ideas and the wisdom of how do emotions work? So let's help children understand, emotions come and go. When you're angry, I'm feeling angry. I'm not angry. You're not anger. You have to learn how to have a healthy relationship to your emotions and how they work so that you can express them constructively and not get stuck.
One of the things that you just said, I was just kind of processing in my mind. You said, when I get angry, I'm not angry.
Right. I'm feeling angry. So I'm having an emotion. So you aren't the emotion. So who you are is much greater and bigger and better. But in that moment, you're in a character, you're playing, and you're feeling angry. So one of the challenges with children is, they get so stuck on different emotions and they feel like they'll never pass. But the reality is that emotions come and go. We know as adults, although we may not always make the right choices, but we know as adults when I'm angry, that anger is not going to be there forever. So if you get stuck in that, that's when these sort of not so smart choices happen. You feel like I'll always be angry, I'll always be sad, or, something will never pass.
Let's talk about those big emotions, because you talk about that in the book. And can you explain what big emotions are for the audience that's listening?
Sure. I mean, as a child, you're new and young to the, young and don't have the wider perspective or the experience that adults have. And typically most kids feel things very intensely. So you're feeling, when you're angry, you feel this anger and you feel like it's bigger than you. So understanding that you're actually bigger than the emotion is important. But, when you have really big emotions, especially as a child, and you don't yet have the skills to handle them, that's what we're talking about. How do you give the kids the ideas and tools and strategies? And of course, parents and teachers, we all need a starting point, right? How do we calm? How do we relax? And of course, what works in second grade may not work in seventh grade, but we need to start somewhere.
In my work, I see some of these big emotions coming out in toddlerhood around the whole topic of picky eating and that struggle for control and independence. Is that something that sets, if parents don't have the skills to help their toddlers, for example, navigate some of those emotions, what's sort of the fallout? And I guess as a backup question to that, what are the tools that parents can use to help teach really young children who obviously do have these, strong or big emotions?
Right. So obviously every child is different. Every child has a different personality, and what works with one child may not work with another. But the Emotionally Healthy Child, the book that I wrote, really works with kids 4 and up, because before 4, there is, from a brain development perspective, logic isn't necessarily online. So, it's really 3 to 4 where a child, you can talk to them and have more reason with them. So that's where the ideas and tools work more consistently, but certainly role modeling with younger children is important. And of course, the most important thing is how do you get them the right, if we're talking about eating, the right vitamins and minerals in a way that works for them, so that's where your specialty comes in.
Yeah. So let's talk about the tools of emotional health, because you do dive into that in the book quite a bit. What can parents learn about some of these tools? What do they need to see in their child to be able to identify whether the child has those tools and is emotionally healthy?
Well, I guess from my perspective, emotional health is the skill of balance. So just the nature of life is, it always throws us off balance, right? So it's how do we get back to center and reset? And that the ideas and tools are ways to do that. So everyone is, if we think of emotional health, it's a lifelong endeavor. So it's not a box that we check. So if I was a parent or teacher looking at my child, I wouldn't say, oh, are you emotionally healthy or not? So it's not a yes or no. It's more of like, how can I help him or her continue to build resilience and have the strategies, and if your child is screaming and slamming doors and saying not so nice things, that they don't yet have this tool. They need more tools in their toolkit. So one concept throughout the book is, that it's how do you help your child, 1, stop and catch themselves, 2, calm, and 3, make a smarter choice. So the tools come in because you want to help a child learn how to calm and then make those smarter choices, which are good for you and good for others. So some strategies could be, I have bubble breathing in the book. I have a tool called the Smart Choices Checklist. There's another tool. It's sort of hand on your heart. Every night before you go to bed, you work with your child to calm and feel relaxed and put their hand on their heart and feel themselves calming. So, for example, if they were in school the next day and they started to get nervous or anxious and they were about to take a test, they could actually put the hand on their heart because their body is learning to have a physical memory of, oh, when I put my hand on my heart, I calm, I feel relaxed again. So it's giving them a strategy like that they can consistently use to help them calm and reset themselves.
So I imagine, I've talked to other experts on this podcast, experts in the area of stress management and anxiety in children. And I imagine that all of these tools and skills work well for all of these, sort of challenges that children are growing up with today.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the goal is to just get a tool that works for your child, right? So whether it's anxiety or stress or, being nervous or fearful, you just want to help them come back to center and come back to that place where they can make a good choice. Like if everyone is cheating on the spelling test, do they cheat or do they not cheat? You know what I mean? You want to help them sort of not listen to their own instincts and develop those good tools.
It sounds like it's an ongoing effort on parents' part.
Absolutely. And of course, we all have different backgrounds and experiences, but the more you, even if it's a few minutes a day, work to keep your emotional house in order, the better it is for your child, which sounds so obvious, but there's the magic of mirror neurons where someone who's in your presence, it's easier for them to learn a skill when you have that skill. Or learning, we have to be honest with our kids. When you say, hey, I haven't had a great day, I'm going to take some deep breaths, or I'm going to need a few minutes alone, or whatever it is. But you show your children, you don't just tell them, you show like, hey, we all have this. We all have to learn how to come back to center. I think that's important.
This episode is brought to you by Nutrition Prep School, a place for parents to learn how to feed and nourish their kids through self-paced educational programs focused on kids of all ages. From babies and picky eaters to athletes and kids with ADHD, Nutrition Prep School has online programs, e-guides, and books to help you feed and nourish your child better. Feeding kids is one of the hardest jobs of being a parent, and I know it's not easy to raise healthy eaters without some basic knowledge about nutrition and some expert tips and guidance. That's why I created Nutrition Prep School. Check it out over at www.nutritionprepschool.com. What if a parent doesn't have their quote-unquote emotional house in order?
Well, I mean, it's just the nature of life that, we're all learning and growing. One minute we're learning about sadness, the next minute we're learning about jealousy, or we're learning about forgiveness or tolerance. So I think the important point is to recognize that we're all in the process of learning, and we can learn alongside our children. There's that idea, I'm sure you know of that book, Filling Your Bucket, right? About happiness. And one of the children I work with, he said to his mom, "You're not acting very well. I think you need to go fill your bucket." And it's true because that's life. We all have to learn together. It's not like I know everything or the child knows everything. It's we all are learning. I mean, we have more experience on the planet, years of living, but we all learn together. And that's why I always think that the parent and the child are always perfectly matched, because there's something that they know and there's something the other one knows, and they're growing together.
Can you expand on perfectly matched, that whole idea? That's a new one for me.
Right. So one of my specialties is highly sensitive children. So children who have, bigger emotions and respond quickly. And I always think that there's a perfect match because oftentimes they're matched with someone who doesn't have that, so that it's almost as if they're very right brained and their parent is very left brained. So they're learning how to do that whole brain thinking on being different. They're growing together on how do you use both logic and intuition or feelings and thoughts. And I think that there's, I guess another way of saying it is I always think there's an opportunity to learn. You know what I mean? And then, when I look at children, I say, okay, what am I learning right now? It might be patience. It might be forgiveness, right? How do I learn to unconditionally love that child in this moment they're having a meltdown? Do you know what I mean? Or how do I stay calm in that moment? I'm learning how to hold my center amidst this moment. So I think there's always an experience for both individuals to learn.
Yeah, I think I have 4 kids. And as you were saying that, I was thinking that, the lesson is perspective. Oftentimes for me, when my child's feeling anxious or worried about something, for me, it's always, keep perspective. Like, don't get sucked into that anxiety about the final exam or, making the starting lineup for XYZ sport. Don't get sucked into that anxiety, but step back and have perspective. That's what I'm learning to, keep an even perspective. Like, this is one day out of your whole life. This doesn't define you or identify who you are. And I think that's a really good point that you make, that, parents are learning something as they are raising their kids too. And I see it a lot with parents who are feeding their kids. And we work a lot on, that interaction that happens between parent and child at the table. And oftentimes when a parent isn't masterful with their feeding interactions or their feeding skills, things break down. And it's where the parent has to learn from the child as well, has to learn to respond to that particular child. So you mentioned the right left brain and understanding how children operate. And I'm not sure if my listeners really have a grasp on, and I'm not, quite frankly, sure I have a grasp on what you mean by right left brain and how the whole brain works together. Can you dive into that a little bit?
Sure. Well, the idea, and I'm oversimplifying it, but just for the sake of grabbing the concept easily, the right brain is typically the imagination, creativity, timelessness. Like if you have a child that doesn't like to be rushed, they're like really in their right brain. They're imaginative, they're creative, they're having fun. And then the left brain is more linear, more logical, more reasonable, more mathematical, more. When you learn language, it's the syntax versus the sound of the language. It's more of the linear. So you want a child to, say, for example, a child has a knee-jerk reaction. This kid says something to them on the playground, and they normally just push the kid, right? So instead of pushing the child, you want them to learn to take a moment, to take a breath, and to walk away. So that would be using their right brain and their left brain, their feelings, and also the logic of like, hey, I could get in trouble. Maybe this isn't the right thing to do. I have another choice in this moment. So they're learning to do whole brain thinking. And it takes practice because most children tend to be a little bit more in the right or the left brain, but you want them to use them both the logic and their feelings.
And so right brain would be more of the feeling side, left brain would be more of the logical side. And would you say that children tend to be more right brain, or do they have like a natural tendency to go one way or the other?
Yeah, they would naturally go you can have 50-50 each, which is great, but kids just tend to go one way or the other. For example, left brain would be like Sheldon Cooper from the Big Bang Theory, just thoughts, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
And then the right brain would be just feelings. So you want them to be able to access both, especially as we think about raising our children to be, great men or great women. You want them to have emotional vulnerability, but strength. You want them to be able to have both.
Yeah, yeah. So, knowing this as a parent, understanding your child in terms of where their tendencies are, does that help parents actually do their job better at raising emotionally healthy children? Is it like, is there like a checklist that parents can see, oh, my child tends to be more right brain and I need to help them get more logical and process things in a little bit more of a logical manner to balance things out? I mean, is that how?
Yeah, in my book, The Emotionally Healthy Child, I talk about that, but it is
Mhm.
helpful. For example, there's one client I'm thinking of I work with this week, and he's very logical. So I knew that I'd have to access that part of him to get into him. You know what I mean? Where someone
Mhm.
else, another person, you might have to start with the feeling. So you want to work on both, but it's sort of what is the way in?
Yeah, I think that's really important, probably for anybody that you're working with, adults and children, to really be able to
Speak their
tap
emotional
into.
language, right?
Yeah,
That's what it is.
yes.
Hmm.
Yeah, and it makes me think too about how we've raised boys, and I think we're getting a lot better at raising boys to be more right brain, I guess if you will, but
Hmm.
that traditional upbringing of men was very left brain, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, no, I would say, and I just had a conversation with someone yesterday on my couch that said, "Hey, should I be worried? My son doesn't really talk about his feelings." It's like, well, there are signs. If he doesn't talk about them, as long as he's expressing them constructively, that's okay. But you want him to have a language. You want him to be able to speak about things if he needs to.
Mhm. And what about girls being more emotional and less logical? Do parents also wanna give them the tools and the language, if you will, to be more logical?
Well, yeah, I mean, and there are certain girls that are all logical and not feeling. So it's certainly, gender is very fluid, as we know. But yeah, I
Mhm.
definitely think that wherever your child is, you want them to have the tools to not only balance a checkbook, but to stand up for themselves on the playground if they're not feeling treated right. You want them to have both.
Mhm. Mhm. So let's talk a little bit about negative emotions and how that can play out in addictive behaviors. And I don't necessarily want to go down the path of the traditional addictive behaviors that adults feel, but I'm thinking more along the lines of eating habits, because that's what I work with. So I see children sometimes who overeat as a way to soothe or calm or numb negative emotions, or they don't eat at all in a way as a way to control those negative emotions. So parents out there, I'm sure, have had experiences where they believe or they think or they're worried that their child may be an emotional eater, meaning that they are, covering those negative emotions or dealing with them using food. What would you have to say about that?
I have a lot to say, actually. So let's see. So the first one is in my book, The Emotionally Healthy Child. I talk about helpful and challenging emotions. I don't use positive and negative for a reason, because all emotions are helpful. All emotions are simply signs to what's going on inside. So I don't want to label things are good and bad, kind of. So for challenging emotions, they're usually faster, like anger, frustration, or even nervousness. So when you have these challenging emotions, the whole goal is to express them constructively, right? So if you don't spot them when they're small, or you don't realize them, they're happening sort of in your subconscious, you're nervous, you're depressed, you're not fully aware. That's when oftentimes children or adults, they make these choices that aren't in their best interest. So
Mhm.
you want to help kids spot them and then lead them toward constructive outlets. So specific to eating, you want them to be making these smart choices. I'm not a big fan of sugar, but you want to have something in moderation. If you see them covering up their feelings with food, that's just a sign they're emotionally, from an emotional health standpoint, they're off balance. They don't have the skills yet to spot emotions and make that smarter choice. So they need to be able to do that. And that's where I think education is so important. you want to teach kids about nutrition and food. And I'm a big fan of education. I've had a lot of clients even take cooking classes, child cooking classes. Do you know what I mean? To get
Yeah.
engaged and learn more, because kids want to feel good. You know what I mean? And they don't realize that oftentimes those food choices contribute to their mood and not feeling well. When they start to connect the dots, they can make better choices.
Kids want to learn, they want to feel good, and they're like little sponges. And if we can be, as adults who are teaching them, positive and, like you said, not labeling things good or bad. The same with food. I feel, you feel those are labels for emotions. I feel the same way about those being labels for food, that they're not really productive for children to, process a good food versus a bad food. Food is food. But when we think about, children who, do eat due to boredom or their emotions, we know that plays out over the course of their lifetime in terms of disconnecting them from their appetite and their regulation, their ability to regulate their intake. It can lead to weight problems, eating habits that aren't great. So how might a parent who is dealing with this actually go through steps to help their child deal with some of those negative emotions? What are some of the tools that they could use, or the steps?
Right. And I in one chapter I talk about mindfulness. So there's a lot of tools in mindfulness. And when you become more mindful and pay attention a certain way without judgment, it can go into every area of your life. But from the standpoint of food, I'm a big believer in knowing your triggers. So I think that it's we're not going to stop a child's natural tendency. If they get sad and they eat bagels when they get sad, that's when they see themselves eating bagels all the time, that should be their trigger. Like, hey, maybe there's something up with me. Do you know what I mean? Because I think oftentimes people they're not consciously aware of all their emotions. So if you can recognize your trigger, hey, I ate a whole box of Skittles. Maybe maybe today didn't really go very well, and I'm trying to hide you know what I mean? I don't want to face it. So being able to, as a parent, know your triggers and begin to see them in your child and help your child develop that self-awareness, I think is very important. Because when you know what you're feeling, you can make better choices. But if you're just not fully aware, it's almost like just using TV to numb yourself out. You just want to be taken away. And I'm not a proponent or, not against television, but I think that we need to use those things more consciously or deliberately or with intent. And then we have better results. You know what I mean? So from my standpoint, I think it's about self-awareness and then being able to spot emotions when they're small and know your individual triggers for your child and yourself.
Yeah, that's good advice. I think I numbed out last night to The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel.
People love that show. I haven't seen it yet, but so many people recommend it to me.
Well, for me personally, when I work with my clients, it's quite emotionally exhausting. By the end of the day, I'm ready to just plop on the couch and not think about anything. I don't want to have a deep conversation with my husband. I don't really want to communicate with my college kids where I have to think about things. I just need to numb out, as you said.
And that's more like decompressing. You're relaxing.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
We have to learn how to relax in our society too, because it's go, go, go. So having time where you just is for you and you fill up your bucket again in what way ever helps you, I think that's important.
Do you ever use that language, fill up your bucket, with kids?
Totally.
Because I really like that.
Totally.
Yeah. So do kids understand what you mean when you say that?
Yeah, and it's based on a children's book, Filling Up Your Bucket, about how we all have this invisible bucket, and that, if you're depleted, you don't have the capacity to handle things. So you need to be able to restore yourself.
Well, Maureen, I love this topic. I think it's so important for parents who are raising children, not that they don't have enough to think about, but I do think this is a topic that really sort of has fingers in so many aspects of raising children. Where can parents learn more about this topic? I know you have your 2 books. Do you have a website? Is there a blog and other resources that you have?
Sure. I mean, go to growinghappykids.com. And that has, there's some free videos. And if you sign up for the newsletter, you have a free chapter. So there's definitely a wealth of resources on growinghappykids.com.
Well, Maureen, thank you so much for coming on the Nourished Child podcast and sharing your wisdom about raising emotionally healthy children. If you want to learn more about emotional health in kids, please be sure to grab Maureen's book, The Emotionally Healthy Child. Stay tuned for my next episode, number 85, where I have Jevi Stone on the show, a 2020 Olympic hopeful in rowing and an emerging emergency room doctor. You will learn a lot about what it takes to train, both physically and mentally, for sport and career. She talks about what she eats, her workout, and her work schedule, and what it takes to balance it all to get to this level of sport. You won't be disappointed. That will be our next show, episode number 85. And by the way, if you want to be sure to hear all the future episodes, be sure to subscribe to The Nourished Child on Apple Podcasts or on one of your favorite Android apps. As always, thanks for joining me today. Tuning in means you're building your knowledge and your toolbox of strategies for nourishing a healthy child inside and out. In other words, when you help yourself, you help your child. Be sure to give the loved ones in your life a loving squeeze today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.